So whether you're a scientist yourself, or you're a graduate student, or an undergrad who's interested in science, or just a layperson interested in science, you really want to be listening to this, because it's really important to not only learn how to think like a scientist and how to apply the scientific method, but it's really important to learn how to conduct interesting research. And this is not something that is often taught, let's say when you're pursuing your PhD. You're taught methodological rigor, you're taught how to conduct a literature review, you're taught, how to apply the scientific method, propose the research questions, posit some hypotheses, develop the data collection procedure to test the hypotheses, collect the data, analyze the data, through some data analytic procedures, some statistical inferencing, and then arrive at a conclusion, offer some practical and theoretical implications, some future research streams, and then voila, you've written a paper, or you've written your doctoral dissertation. And that's all great. Of course, we want to teach people how to do good science, but how do you teach people how to do interesting science? Now, this is something that I've been railing against for much of my career, because I very quickly learned that most academic research is astoundingly boring. Astoundingly boring, not because there aren't many interesting things to study, but it's because people end up being focused on the wrong things. So they sacrifice interestingness for rigor. But of course, these are not mutually exclusive metrics, right? You could be very rigorous, both in terms of the internal and external validity of your research, while also being interesting. And I don't mean to, by the way, imply that interesting means that it has to be something that is covered on the 6 o'clock news, that it has to be sexy and therefore somehow, flippant research. Not at all. You can say some unbelievably powerful things about the human condition, if we're talking about research in the human context, that are, you go, wow, this is interesting. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love the behavioral sciences, right? Why I love consumer psychology and evolutionary psychology. There are so many fascinating things that we can study, but people end up being stuck in designing very rigorous experiments or developing mathematical models that are really tight. But then the ultimate question is just pure bullshit. And it kind of came back to the forefront of my mind because I just returned. I was in Miami. I was attending the Academy of Marketing Science conference, which was this year being held in Miami. And so as I was going to the various sessions, I couldn't help but, think that which I thought in so many other academic conferences, which is, boy, this is some bullshit research. And again, I don't mean that as it's not an arrogant statement. I'm not trying to be elitist. Again, the researchers who are presenting their work, in most cases, are doing the science, but they're not doing interesting science. Okay, so how do we decide what constitutes interesting? Isn't it, in the eye of the beholder? Isn't it subjective? Well, I mean, to some extent, yes, but there are some ways by which we can create a taxonomy or a framework for saying, all other things equal, this research question is likely to bear more interesting fruits than this research question. Let me start by giving some examples of what I would consider interesting research in psychology in general, and then later I'm going to give specific examples within evolutionary psychology. This is a list that I had first. I'll come back to the list in a second. So whenever I teach any course, whether it be at the undergraduate, the MBA, the Masters of Science, or PhD level, I often will revert back to arguably the three greatest experiments ever conducted in psychology. Number one, many of you have heard, of course, the obedience to roles experiment, the Zimbardo experiments at Stanford, where Philip Zimbardo took a bunch of undergrads and randomly made half of them be corrections officers, the other half be prisoners, and then watched their behaviors unfold. And then he had to stop the experiment on ethical grounds because those who were imbued with the role of being corrections officers internalized that role and became quite sadistic towards their fellow undergraduate students who were playing the role of prisoners. And so that was interesting in that you saw what happens to people when they are adhering to certain role expectations. But that study, notwithstanding how famous it was, is not as interesting, if you'd like, as, of course, the Stanley Milgram experiments. And there, for those of you who may remember, this is where Stanley Milgram devised an experimental design to try to address that which he had often heard regarding some of the Nazis and German soldiers who said, hey, I was just obeying, an authority figure. I was just obeying orders. I'm not a bad guy. I'm not an evil guy. And so he wanted to actually test, can you get people to do horrible things simply because they are put in a situation where they're going to, there's going to be pressure on them to conform to that authority. And so he devised an experiment, a paradigm, experimental paradigm, whereby he brought in two people to the lab. One of them was, quote, randomly determined to be the teacher. The other one was the student. But I say, quote, randomly because the teacher, it was the actual subject. The student was actually a Confederate, meaning it's a person who is pretending to be a subject or a participant, but really they're in on the experiment. And so he would put them in separate rooms and he'd say, oh, I'm trying to gauge how well people learn as a function of, being punished. So does a schedule of reinforcement cause people to learn better or something to that effect? And so the teacher is going to read a bunch of paired associates to the student. Young man, blue car, big house, right? So these are paired associates. And the teacher is asks the student who's in another room, please memorize these paired associates. And then when you go back and you say, young, the student is supposed to say man. If he doesn't say the right correlate, paired associate, then he is zapped with an electric volt. And of course, unbeknownst to the actual teacher, there is no voltage that's being assigned, but he doesn't know that. And so on the other hand, on the other side, you hear the student sort of screaming, ow, this hurts, and so on. And these voltages become increasingly stronger, to a point where it says, danger, do not administer, this will cause death. And just to get to the punchline, many people, well more than what you might have otherwise imagined, end up zapping a fellow human being to the point of causing them great harm, if not death, because every time they would look and turn and say, hey, should I go on? The person in the white lab coat say, hey, you've agreed to participate in this experiment, just do it, follow the instructions. And so the point was to show that people could really be put in situations where they violate what they would have thought otherwise is their moral compass, because, and of course this is not to justify the Nazis and the German soldiers in World War II. Now, the reason why this was incredible is because when you went ahead and asked clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, hey, how many people do you think would be psychopathic enough to actually administer enough voltage to kill someone? I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was something in the order of, 1 in 1,000. And it turns out that an astonishingly greater number than that were able to be coerced into doing these awful things unbeknownst to them. So that was surprising. It was like, wow, this, and by the way, the psychologists were so incredulous regarding the results that they said, bullshit, you're no way, Milgram, you're making this stuff up. And so that's why he ended up taping the experiments. And so you can actually go and watch these tapes experiment. Usually you don't necessarily have to tape these experiments if it's not relevant for the data analysis. But here, in a sense, it was a dear diary. It was laying witness to the fact that, no, look, these are really things that are happening. So it allowed us to see something that we thought, most humans would not do, and therefore it was surprising, therefore it was interesting. And again, here I'm giving you anecdotal evidence of interesting research. I will talk about a formal way by which we can establish what constitutes interesting research. And then arguably the one that even impresses me more than the Milgram experiment is one that some of you may have heard me talk about before, the Solomon-Asch conformity experiment. This is where, and again, for those of you who know it, forgive me, bear with me, but this is where, by the way, people who are requesting to speak, your requests are going to go unheeded, because in these general sessions I just lecture, and then if you wish to ask questions either directly to me or via, oftentimes I take written questions and you have to subscribe to my content. No, that's not because I'm Jewish and, Jew trying to make money. It's because that's one of the exclusive benefits that I offer people, as do many other content creators, for people to subscribe to exclusive content, right? So if you wish to interact with me and so on, then please subscribe for my content. It's in the order of a latte per month. Okay, so, and you certainly get a lot more worth than a latte in subscribing to the content. So there's no point asking for speaking privileges here, because I'm just going to be lecturing. So the Solomon-Asch experiment, think of it this way: there are 3 lines of very different lengths. So lines A, B, C, and then next to it, but separate, there's another line X. Now X, let's say, is the same length as line B, and it's clear, like there's absolutely no way, unless you were, absolutely blind, that you wouldn't be able to tell that line X is the same length as line B. But the point is to see whether, if you get a bunch of people to give the wrong answer, when you ask the question, which of lines A, B, and C are the same as line X? So if I bring in 8 people into the lab and I put the first 7, they're Confederates, meaning they're fake subjects, but the 8th subject doesn't know this. So the first person, when you ask them which of lines A, B, or C is the same length as line X, the correct answer is B. But then the first person says, oh, it's A, and A is like 5 times longer than X. So it's no way that you can say that. He says A, the second person says A, the third person says A, the fourth person says A. So as you can see, there is this weight of conformity that's being built on the shoulders of the last person. And then the point is to see whether that person will conform. In other words, will they go against their lying eyes for a stimulus that is completely clear? There's no way you can get this wrong, right? I mean, literally, so that's what makes it so powerful, the experiment, because the real world has grayness. The real world has fuzziness. There's nothing fuzzy about this. Line B is the same length as line X, and line A and C are very, very different length. And yet, when you get to person 8, even if one person had conformed, that would be surprising, and yet many more than one person conform, demonstrating the unbelievable power of group conformity in shaping our behavior. So I talk about this when I then discuss many consumer behavior contexts that are shaped by conformity. Take, for example, the fashion industry. The fashion industry is just one big cyclical orgiastic conformity experiment. Okay, everybody, today you all wear blue. Okay, assholes, no more blue, that's out, you wear green. And we all nod along and follow the fashionistas, right? So the power of that experiment is it demonstrated in an incredibly elegant and simple design something that is incredibly powerful and interesting about the human condition, which is you can get people to follow suit and conform even in contexts where it should be impossible for you to be giving the wrong answer. That's interesting. That's powerful. It didn't take a fancy convoluted experimental design. It didn't take fancy mathematical modeling. It didn't take fancy, procedural convoluted designs. Very simple, elegant experiment demonstrating something universal and powerful and therefore interesting. Okay. So now we come to, so how can we determine what's interesting? What if I find dolphin mating behavior interesting, whereas you find, the evolution of a particular uh, plant morphology to be interesting? How, you're a botanist and you're interested in plants, and I'm a, marine biologist and I'm interested in dolphin mating behavior. How are we to judge whether my work is interesting or yours? And as I said, yes, there are individual idiosyncratic personal differences, but there should be a way by which we can talk about, all other things considered, things that are interesting or not. Most academics could not give a damn whether their research is interesting. As a matter of fact, they take great pride in the fact that, they don't look at such vulgar things. They do rigorous research. No, that's bullshit. When I sat down at many of those academic conference meetings, as I did now this past week in Miami, I was seriously considering whether I should inject Ebola both in my eyes and ears so that I could be protected from some of the quote research that I was seeing. Now, again, it's not because the people who are doing the research are dumb. They're not. They're very good methodologists. They know how to apply the scientific method to test something. But what they're testing is completely useless. So I'm going to come in a second to the paper in question that I wanted to talk about today in terms of how do you establish that something is interesting. But first, I wanted to read to you a part of a review that I had written. So for those of you who don't know, the way academic research is judged is that it goes out to a journal. Okay, let's suppose, Journal of Consumer Psychology. So if I want to send a paper to that journal, I send it to the editor. The editor will decide who are the reviewers that are most likely to be well suited to review this paper, and then it will go out for review, and then the results come back. Either reject this paper, it sucks, uh, accept it with, or please resubmit, but please implement these major revisions. Please resubmit, but implement these minor revisions, or accept as is. Now, for most papers, it'll go through multiple rounds of back and forth until at one point it gets to, okay, this paper is ready to be accepted. And so, as an academic, as a professor, one of the uh, professional, if you like, obligations that are part of your job as an academic is to serve as a reviewer on for various journals. And so I've reviewed, innumerable papers. I do it a lot less these days because at this stage of my career, my time is taken by other things, and I've already I've put in my time for 30 years. But probably not probably, the singular most common feedback that I gave a paper when I was reviewing it uh, is basically that it wasn't interesting. Okay. Of course, that's not the only problem. Sometimes there are, data analytic problems, data collection problems. There are internal validity problems. The research design was not well developed. The hypotheses were not good. I mean, there's a million reasons why a paper can go wrong, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But the fundamental one is you would read a paper, at least for me, I would say, this this sucks. I mean, of course, I didn't put it in those words. So I'm going to read you first. I'm going to read you an actual part of a review that I had written. So here we go. So perhaps the first criterion that any scholar should pose when embarking on a new research project is how interesting the expected findings are likely to be. While it is clear that not every research project will be earth-shattering, one of the first metrics that should be used in evaluating a study is how novel and non-trivial the findings will prove to be. Regrettably, the current paper fails in delivering on these crucial epistemological metrics. Obtaining significant effects is insufficient in judging the intellectual contributions of a study. The directional relationships in the Lisrel model is a type of causal model, where you're showing which variables cause which other variables in a path analysis. So the directional relationships in the Lisrow model are largely self-evident. Statistical and methodological rigor do not compensate for results that are minimally surprising. If one were to sample 1,000 lay people and ask them to predict the directional relationships obtained in the current study, I suspect that most, if not all, will provide the correct predictions, i.e. those reported in the structural model. If the authors are unfamiliar with the classic philosophy of science paper by Davis, 1971, I highly recommend that they read it. It should provide them with powerful guidelines in judging what might constitute interesting research worthy of their intellectual efforts. So this was a part of a review that I had written for a paper, but that exact, what I just read to you is something that I've written probably for 100 different papers through all my career. So now, what is this paper by Davis, 1971? So this is a paper that I always assign to my doctoral students and at times to my master's students, because it is a brilliant paper that tries to find a method or a framework or a set of criteria that allows us to say, if a paper passes one or more of these criteria, then at least it looks like it's going to be an interesting paper. The general structure, so he proposes, Davis, who was a sociologist, he's passed away. Let me first read you the reference, because if any of you want to track it, it's actually a paper that I had recommended to my subscribers probably a month or two ago. I often will recommend classic academic papers, or I make book recommendations to my subscribers. So that's one of the things that you can get in terms of exclusive content if you subscribe to my content. But let me now mention the paper. It's by Murray S. Davis. It's a 1971 paper. It's published in the Philosophy of the Social Sciences. It starts on page 309. It's titled, "That's Interesting!" Towards a phenomenology of sociology and a sociology of phenomenology. Basically, what he's doing there in the "That's Interesting!" paper, he's saying, well, how do we go about establishing something that's interesting? So let me read you the summary of the paper and maybe the first paragraph, and then I will drill down what some of these criteria are. So this is from the paper, page 309. Question: how do theories which are generally considered interesting differ from theories which are generally considered non-interesting? Answer: interesting theories are those which deny certain assumptions of their audience, while non-interesting theories are those which affirm certain assumptions of their audience. This answer was arrived at through the examination of a number of famous social and especially sociological theories. That examination also generated a systematic index of the variety of propositional forms which interesting and non-interesting theories may take. The fertility of this approach suggested a new field be established called the sociology of the interesting, which is intended to supplement the sociology of knowledge. This new field will be phenomenologically oriented insofar as it will focus on the movement of the audience's mind from one accepted theory to another. It will be sociologically oriented insofar as it will focus on the dissimilar baseline theories of the various sociological categories which compose the audience. In addition to its value in interpreting the social impact of theories, the sociology of the interesting can contribute to our understanding of both the common sense and scientific perspectives on reality. So just to kind of summarize, what he's basically saying there is, can we come up with a framework that allows us to establish in a meaningful academic way how we can measure what constitutes interesting scientific research? So let me just read you the first paragraph of the paper after that summary, and then I'll describe some of the 12 criteria that he proposed. So, it has long been thought that a theorist is considered great because his theories are true, but this is false. A theorist is considered great not because his theories are true, but because they are interesting. Those who carefully and exhaustively verify trivial theories are soon forgotten, whereas those who cursorily and expediently verify interesting theories are long remembered. In fact, the truth of a theory has very little to do with its impact, for a theory can continue to be found interesting even though its truth is disputed, even refuted. So there you go. What he's saying is that even if your theory is wrong, the fact that it triggers a sense of that's interesting, well, you're doing good research. So, what are some of the criteria that he talks about? So let me just mention these. He basically, I'm not going to go through all 12 criteria, but it's basically, we thought that A causes B, but it turns out that B causes A. We thought that A and B are correlated. It turns out that A and B are not at all correlated. We thought that the phenomenon was singularly caused by a single factor. It turns out to be multifactorial. So as you can see, it's always, we thought that it was X, but it turns out that it's not X. Now, of course, you can quibble with this. You could say, well, it can't only be that interesting research is surprising research, and it isn't, right? That's why I'm saying this is not the end-all taxonomy for judging interesting research, but it has to make you go, wow, I didn't know that. That's cool, right? So let me give you an example. I often use this, and by the way, at the Academy of Marketing Science conference that I was at this past week in Miami, I made it my express purpose to sit down with young doctoral students and young assistant professors to chat rather than the obnoxious older know-it-all professors, precisely because I was trying to hopefully impart some of my experience onto them, and frankly, we had some really nice conversation because they're all looking for what should they study in their doctoral dissertation and so on. And so I was trying to explain to them some of the stuff that I'm talking to you about here. Well, life is short, right? Let me give you an example. You could do an incredibly rigorous study. By the way, the example that I'm giving is literally one that was done, where you use some fancy statistical procedures. You can, it's full of very fancy Greek letters and mathematical symbols and incredibly complicated design, and yet the final result is customers who are more satisfied at this particular establishment are more likely to return to the establishment. Holy shit. Move aside Darwin, move aside Newton, move aside Kepler. You're a bullshitter, Galileo. We've got real science going on here. A customer who is more satisfied at a restaurant is more likely to return to the restaurant. I mean, who could have thought of such a brilliant finding, right? Now, note, the way that was established was very rigorous. It was very scientifically valid. It had the methodological rigor. The literature review was thorough. It passed all of those those procedural metrics. But the bottom line is bullshit. Who gives a shit? Who didn't know this? Who didn't know that more satisfied customers are more likely to return? If anything, it would be the opposite that would be interesting. No, satisfaction at a store does not predict your return behavior, your return patronage. That would be surprising. Okay? So one of the things I tell people is do meaningful research. I mean, by the way, this applies in any field, but imagine in a field in the behavioral sciences, in consumer behavior, right? Much of our human nature manifests itself in the consumatory context. That's why I love studying, the consuming instinct, the biological roots of consumption. But there are so many cool things to study. Okay, so let me give you some examples of things that I've studied that, if you forgive me, I would consider to be quite interesting. How about this one? The effects of conspicuous consumption on men's testosterone levels, right? So we meaning myself and a former graduate student of mine, we actually had men drive a fancy Porsche. We rented out a Porsche, or drive a beaten up old sedan in two environments, either in downtown Montreal on the weekend where everybody can see you driving those cars, or in a semi-deserted highway where there isn't an audience effect. And we measured salivary assays before and after the driving conditions. And what we of course found that, the endocrinological system blows up, responds very clearly in ways that you would expect from animal behavior. When two, let's say, males fight, the winner has a rise in testosterone, the loser has a drop in testosterone. You see that even, say, in sports. The winning team has a rise in testosterone, the losing team has a drop in testosterone. You even see that amongst the fans of those teams who have a vicarious response of testosterone. That's interesting, right? Because, you're showing why sports consumption is so immersive, because the fans end up being as vested, endocrinologically speaking, as the actual athletes themselves, right? It was life or death for us when Lionel Messi was playing the World Cup final. And as I've explained on Joe Rogan's show, why? Who cares? Lionel Messi doesn't care if I win or lose, yet somehow I was completely vested. We were all completely vested in Argentina winning the World Cup in a cosmically just manner, right? So I've done research looking at how the menstrual cycle affects women's consumatory behaviors. Do they dress more sexily when they're ovulating? Does their food-related behaviors change when they're ovulating? This is not the typical thing that people will say, oh yeah, of course, I knew that. I know that women are more likely to wear stilettos when they are ovulating, right? So it's interesting. It's not expected. You're taking research that has been applied across other mammalian species and demonstrating that the female consumer in the human context engages in the same homologous behaviors. Okay, I've done research looking at how birth order effects manifest themselves in a marketing related context. Birth order effects is, what is your birth order? Are you the firstborn, the secondborn, the lastborn? And there's great research from Frank Soloway showing that there are some really interesting Darwinian reasons why birth order effects exist in the way that they do. And so I took those principles and I applied them with one of my former doctoral students to the consumer context. And it was very, very surprising and innovative research. I won't go through all of my research. I mean, I've studied, Darwinian exploration of suicide and economic conditions. I've explored Munchausen syndrome by proxy from a Darwinian perspective, paper that I published in a medical journal back in 2010. It's my work on Munchausen syndrome by proxy that led me to then propose the collective malady of collective Munchausen and collective Munchausen by proxy in my book, The Parasitic Mind, right? This is not standard stuff that you would see from a business school professor, right? Because I wanted to follow interesting, exciting problems. If you forgive me for, tooting my own horn for a moment, because I'm doing it because I'm talking about interesting research. The reason why I can have the platform that I have, the fact that I can go on very, very popular shows and discuss, my academic research and the academic research of other people, is precisely because I am well calibrated to understand what people are interested in. And so it's not as though I only do research that is sexy that I could talk about on the Megyn Kelly show, but I am well calibrated to say, wait a minute, life is short. There are a lot of really interesting problems and mysteries to solve. Let's not waste time on myopic bullshit. Let's tackle big problems. And then people respond to that, right? Be a big thinker, be a synthetic thinker. So let me give you examples of what I would, so this is, I gave you a few examples from my own research, but let me give you examples of other people's research that I would consider to be interesting, okay? Some of you may have heard me talk about this. These are, the studies that I'm about to mention are not my own studies, but they are from evolutionary-minded researchers. So for example, there's this great work on Darwinian gastronomy. Darwinian gastronomy is looking at culinary traditions from an evolutionary perspective. So Paul Sherman and some of his colleagues, Paul Sherman is a neuroscientist from my alma mater at Cornell, wanted to look at why is it that some culinary traditions are more likely to be spicy while others are less spicy. Why is Mexican food spicy but Swedish food is bland? Now, if you're a cultural anthropologist or a cultural psychologist, you would simply revel in saying, oh yeah, Mexican food is more spicy than Swedish food. Good night, everyone. It ends there. But the more interesting question is to ask the Darwinian why. Is there a causative explanation that can explain the distribution of spice use around the globe? And the answer turns out to be a resounding yes. It's based on something called the antimicrobial hypothesis, which basically says that culinary traditions, which is it's a cultural form, evolve to be of a particular form to solve biological problems. So in the context of spice use, spices have an antimicrobial property. They help against foodborne pathogens, right? And therefore, in cultures where the ambient temperature is higher, therefore there's a greater proliferation of food pathogens, there's a greater density of food pathogens, you need to find some cultural adaptation to attenuate that problem. How do you do that? Well, there's many ways you could do it. You could engage in greater use of spice. You could have more vegetable-based foods than animal protein foods, because that will have a greater amount, the latter will have greater amount of foodborne pathogens. You could use pickling. You could use salting. You could use smoking of food. All of these cultural adaptations solve a biological problem. That's interesting! Exclamation point. When I lecture about this, you could see that you could hear a pin drop in the room. I'm not saying obvious bullshit. People say, "Wow, that's interesting. Now I get why Malaysian food and Mexican food are spicier than Scottish and Swedish food." I'd never thought that it could be linked in this biologically meaningful way. Okay, let me give you another example. When a baby is born, most family members are likely to state that the baby looks like the father, and more so when it's the family members stemming from the mother's family. Now, why is that? In the human context, we are a biparental species, right? Meaning that men and women invest heavily in their children. Of course, women more than men, but as mammalian species go, human beings, human dads are super dads. We really do invest quite heavily in our children. Therefore, it doesn't make evolutionary sense for our male ancestors to not have cared whether their women go around behind their backs, because then it's an evolutionary dead end. You're spending all of your time investing in little Matteo, who turns out to be looking a lot more like your sexy Italian gardener. That's not a good thing. I don't want to be spending 18 years investing in Matteo if he's not mine. Therefore, in an environment where we didn't have DNA paternity testing, you evolve the cultural norm of when the baby comes out, you end up saying, "Oh my God, he looks exactly like you, Tony." Even though objectively speaking, that's pure shite. Because objectively, the morphological features of the newborn have not yet sufficiently developed so that you are able to say that that baby looks like the father. And yet people say it, and much more so when they're from the mother's side from the family. Why? Because the mother's side of the family wants to convince Tony, "Don't worry, our daughter did not cheat on you. Stick around with her. He looks exactly like yours." And I often have joked, although it's a real story, that I always say I should have really then worried about my wife, because when we had our first child, when my wife was pregnant with our first child, our daughter, and we had put up the ultrasound image, when you get that first trimester ultrasound, you put it on the fridge. Well, that image of whatever that ultrasound is, it could look like a COVID virus, it could look like a reptile, it could look like an alien. Yet my mother-in-law came over and looked at it and said, "Oh my God, the baby looks exactly like you, Gad. In utero." Right? So a blob apparently looked exactly like me. Now, why did she say that? Well, because subconsciously to her, she was compelled to assuage my paternity uncertainty, which makes me think, why was my mother-in-law so concerned about making sure that her daughter had not cheated on me? Yes, I'm joking in this part. The children, luckily for me, do look like a mix of my wife and me. But in any case, that is an interesting finding. I've never shared that finding, and people said, "Oh yeah, come on, we all knew that." On the contrary, people say, "Oh wow, wow, that's so interesting. That's wow. You know what? I remember that's what happened with our. Yeah, you're right. Wow, that's what an okay. That's the beauty of, by the way, evolutionary psychology, because it allows us to uh, decode these very complex human behaviors through a beautifully coherent, parsimonious lens, which is called the evolutionary lens. Let me just mention maybe two more I'll do. Here's one. Environmental stressors and the onset of menarche. Menarche, or in English you say menarche, is the onset of the menses for a young girl, meaning the first time that she has her menstrual cycle. Well, some little girls will get it at 10, some will get it at 14. Well, it turns out that there is an environmental stressor that can move girls to either have their menarche earlier or later. And one that is very, very powerful in predicting that is whether there is father present or father absent. And it turns out the guru of this research is someone that I know well, Bruce Ellis, an evolutionary psychologist. He used to be at University of Arizona, actually, where I had given this talk that I'm looking at the slides now, back in 2008. He's now at, I think, University of Utah. So he's looked at father absence and the onset of menarche, and it turns out that if there is a father absent, little girls have their periods earlier. One argument being that when you no longer have that male presence, you want to enter the reproductive window earlier in your life trajectory. Well, that's interesting. You wouldn't have thought that. That's surprising. That's quite revolutionary. You wouldn't have thought to link a reality from the makeup of a family, in this case, whether a father is present or not, and a physiological response like when a girl gets her menstrual cycle. That's interesting. You're linking an environmental stressor to a physiological reality, an evolved physiological reality. Okay, one more let me do. This is from Thornhill and Gengestead, both of whom I know well. Thornhill has even been on my show, Randy Thornhill. They did an amazing study about, I can't remember which year it was, maybe 15, 20 years ago, where I think maybe 1997, I can't remember when it was, where they showed that women, okay, well, let me set it up. So let's say you bring in a bunch of men to the lab, you ask them to wear a t-shirt, okay, so that it becomes imbued with their smell. Then they take off that t-shirt, then you put those t-shirts in a plastic bag, and you ask women to then come into the lab and rate how pleasant the smell of each of those t-shirts is. And it turns out that the one that on average women find to be the most pleasant smelling turns out to be also the guy who is the most symmetric, physically symmetric. So I often, when I tell my students, I say the nose knows, meaning that here, this is what I call, by the way, in some of my papers, I talked about sensorial convergence. What does that mean? That means two different senses are converging on, individual B as being the superior genetic stock. Whether I smell him, I'm also effectively identifying the guy who is the most symmetric guy, which makes evolutionary sense, because if a guy is the top dog when it comes to his phenotype, then whether I smell him, touch him, hear him, you look at him, it should converge to the same guy. If I decide that the top guy is A, if I smell him, but the top guy is B, if I hear him, but the top guy is C. If I see him, then I would be stuck. Who do I pick? But as you might expect, if you are of the highest phenotypic quality, then there should be what I call sensorial convergence. That's interesting. That's not something you could have expected. You could imagine how all of those studies that I just mentioned to you are a lot more powerful and interesting than if a consumer really likes a restaurant, he's more likely to return to that restaurant. Okay. Notice, I'm not saying that marketing as an academic discipline is not interesting, right? I'm not saying that consumer psychology is not interesting or any less scientific. Nothing could be further from the truth. But precisely because it has the capacity to be so interesting, let's not waste time doing incredibly rigorous research that's otherwise pure shite when it comes to being interesting. Okay? That's the important point. So there you have it, folks. The reason why I was just excited to do this today is, well, I guess, as I said, it's because I just came back from an academic conference, but it's because I love academia. I love research. So this is not an attack on research, but human beings or any biological agent faces trade-offs, faces costs and benefits, faces opportunity costs. If you spend 3-4 years doing incredibly rigorous research to demonstrate that customers who are happy with a restaurant are more likely to return to the restaurant, you've wasted hundreds of thousands of taxpayer money. You've wasted your valuable time. You've wasted opportunity costs because you could have studied all sorts of other interesting things. So I think it is absolutely imperative that all graduate students, as they're being trained to become future scientists, are taught what I am offering in this X Spaces, which is always at the forefront of your thinking. You should be saying, never mind whether it's rigorous research, because it's expected that you have to be doing rigorous research. Are you doing meaningful, impactful, novel, interesting research? And I venture to say, regrettably, that most academics will spend their merely career not caring about that. And that is regrettable. So there you have it, folks. I have posted earlier today a thread for subscribers where I asked them, hey, you've got till, I can't remember what time I said, like 9 p.m. today to write questions there. And as long as you get in those questions before 9 p.m., then I will either today or tomorrow respond to your written questions. So if you wish to ask me any questions as relating to today's session, please don't go there and ask me questions about the Israel-Gaza situation. Not that I don't want to answer those questions, but I like to restrict a given session to the theme that we're covering that day. So if you have any questions about the topic that I discussed today, you'd like to ask me it and have a response from me, please consider subscribing to my exclusive content. I will be posting this chat eventually both on my YouTube channel, my podcast, and also posting it directly on X. So thank you all for coming. Happy, well, I don't know if we should say happy Memorial Day, but rather let us take a moment and honor those who've fought and lost their lives precisely so we can have the freedom to engage in the types of dialogues that we're doing now. Don't take for granted these freedoms and liberties. Most of human history has not been defined by the free societies that we currently live in, but are losing at an astonishing rate. Get involved. Your voice matters. Vote properly when it comes to elections. Vote based on issues. And let us hope that we can protect not only the scientific ethos that has made our societies enlightened, but that allows us to pursue truth and freedom unencumbered by all sorts of authoritarian ideologies. Take care, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for joining me. Cheers.